This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
This morning we are talking about boys in education and why we keep talking about it. Why have we been having this same conversation for the last at least 50 years, but not doing anything about the actual issue?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday, the 26th of April, 2025. This is the Saturday Breakfast Show here on Teachers Talk Radio with me, your host, Darren Lester. It is so lovely to be spending this Saturday morning with you, as we always do, each and every week. How has your fortnight been? Because I wasn't here last weekend. I kind of took the Easter weekend off. So I was away, but I hope that you've all had a good one. Mine has been nice. I've been still pushing through with my year 11s, bless them, as we get closer to the exams happening. I've been doing lots of speaking practice with my modern language students. I've been doing lots of past papers with my classic students. It's been a really productive 2 weeks, and it's really lovely to see how they've been progressing and to see how in such a very short space of time they have managed to move themselves forward. I always love this time of year for that, for really seeing exactly how well our students have done. I understand that we are probably not going to have very many people live this morning because, of course, we are clashing with the funeral of Pope Francis. I think it's important to take a moment right now to recognize the influence of the Pope over education. Now, I'm not Catholic. And I don't know why I feel the need to preface what I'm about to say with that. I suppose it's because whenever you say something positive about somebody online, you always get jumped on with, oh, well, you're a fan. Oh, well, you're going to say that because of X, Y, and Z. It's almost impossible just to appreciate somebody. But I'm not a Catholic by any stretch of the imagination. But I still think it's important to recognize that Pope Francis was a staunch advocate for education. And I think it's important for us to recognize exactly how important that is. Now, Catholicism, of course, is one of the, if not the biggest branches of Christianity. I'm just double checking my figures as we speak. Yeah, it says, Google tells us that there are approximately 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. That's a huge number of people. That's what, an eighth, a seventh of the total world population. And the Pope has the Pope has, because the office still remains, even though Francis has passed, the Pope has a huge sway over the opinions, the thoughts of those billion people. And so it is really important for us to understand exactly what impact the Pope's words can have on generations of Catholics. And like I said, Pope Francis was a staunch advocate for education. He very much valued the power of education. In fact, it was early last year, I believe, in 2024, it was about February time, he was in Madrid and he used his platform there to reinforce the church's commitment to education in Spain. And he highlighted the importance of education in Catholic institutions. And what really leapt out at me as a non-Catholic was the fact that he really pushed for education to be inclusive and accessible to everybody. He said, there we go, education is above all an act of hope in those before us, in their possibilities to change and contribute to the renewal of society. So he really recognized the fact that education can be and should be a way to improve not just our own individual lives, but also the lives of everybody around us. And I think that's a really, really important message for all of us to remember. He said that everybody has a right to education. He was very, very clear about that. It's not that everybody should have, it's that everybody has a right to education. No one should be excluded. He said, I cannot help but remember the many children and young people who do not have access to education in different parts of the world, who suffer oppression and even war and violence. And he said that we, as educators, we need to make sure that we don't let this quote unquote throwaway culture that we seem to have adopted become almost an excuse to overlook people. He said, the creation of relationships of justice among peoples, the capacity for solidarity towards the needy, and the care of the common home will pass through the hearts, minds, and hands of all those who are being educated today. So he suggested that those in our care, those who come to us for education, they're going to take with them the values that we espouse. Now, certainly in the UK, that is actually a very controversial opinion because, and it's fair, a lot of people will say that they don't want their children to be indoctrinated, quote unquote. They will say that it's not the teacher's role to pass on moral, ethical values. You know, we are there to pass on information, which I do think is a fair point. I do think that's a fair statement. But I think we also should keep in mind that we don't display morals and values by overt teaching. We don't get up on in front of our whiteboards and write morals in a nice black pen and then, list all of the things that we think our children ought to believe. We demonstrate morals and values through the way we interact with our young people, through how we respond to them not understanding something, how we respond to them not bringing in their homework. Things like clarity, compassion, justice, those are all things that as human beings, we demonstrate constantly just through the act of being, just through our nature of being people. That's not something that as teachers we can hide. And I think quite often when people like the Pope talk about extolling the virtues of morality onto young people, that's what they're talking about. It's not about us standing up and explaining what our political views are, what our religious beliefs are, what our ethical values are. It's just about us demonstrating what comes down to basic human compassion, I think. And quite often, particularly when we're being bombarded with this message of, don't share your political views, don't share your beliefs, don't share your morals, we quite often forget that these are not things that you just stand up and talk about. Talking about a morality is not the same as having a morality. It's the way that you move yourself through the world. And I think that when it came down to it, that's what Pope Francis was trying to talk about when he was saying these things, when he was talking about the importance of education, that it is, of course, it is the the information that we give our children. For me, it's the teaching of how to conjugate verbs. It's the broadening of the worldview. It's the introduction to new culture. But more importantly, as importantly, I will say as importantly, because I never want to kind of be part of the rhetoric of devaluing the education part of education. So as importantly, it's about showing the young people compassion. It's about recognizing their own humanity, their own virtue, and just showing them what it means to be a nice person, a good person, operating in the world. The Pope said, specifically about Catholic education, but I do think that this can be broadened out to all education. He said that the distinctive feature of Catholic education is true humanization. That arises from faith and generates culture. So he talked about how it's very important for the education system of a country to recognize, reflect, build, shape the cultural values of that country, which ties in quite nicely to what we're going to talk about today, with how boys are treated in education, and then particularly within the UK, how the class system impacts how we treat boys in education. But it is, when we have our young people all kind of cloistered together for 6-7 hours a day, they are the ones who will eventually shape society. They are the ones who are going to go out into the world and become the leaders, become the adults who create what a society is. And so the way that they see us as their teachers, as their role models behave, is what they are going to emulate. And so again, it is up to us to make sure that we model all of those positive virtues, the compassion, the humility, the niceties, so that is hopefully what they will build within their own cultural context. In this same address that he gave to Spanish educators early last year, he said that teachers should continue to reflect and continue to walk together. And they must make sure that they are the artisans of peace. He said education is not possible without betting on freedom, opening the way to social friendship and the culture of encounter. And this has become really important to me over the past couple of years in particular. This idea of teachers working together to make sure that we really get the best out of ourselves and out of each other is why I'm so grateful that I have this platform with you every Saturday morning to sit and connect to other educators, because I want to learn from other teachers, and I want to take the opportunity of this platform to share what I learn from my readings, from my experiences in the classroom, so that we can all connect, because ultimately we all have the same goal. Quite often, whether we see it or not, our profession does try to pit us against each other. If you are in secondary education, then you may feel like you are competing with other teachers in your school for children to do your subject at GCSE, A level, AP level, depending on what your own context is. You may feel that when the inspectorate comes in, Ofsted, ISI, whoever it is that you have inspect you, and they give you a judgment, that then is putting you in competition with the school down the road. We all know that our funding is dictated by the number of children on our roll, and that's true in both state and fee-paying schools. Schools have so much more in common than they have in competition. And I think, as I said at TTR Connect back in March, creating a community of practice, creating these groups of people who have the same goals as you, who have the same interests as you, who just want to work together to improve the conditions that they are in, to improve education and not just complain about what's going on. That's what we should be fighting for. That's what is really important. And so, as Pope Francis's life is being celebrated today, his funeral is happening as we speak. I think it's important that we don't let those messages, regardless of your own religious beliefs, it's important that we don't let his messages of the value of education, the importance of togetherness, be buried along with him. We don't know who the next Pope is going to be. We don't know whether the next Pope is going to be as progressive as Pope Francis was. We don't know what I'm assuming it's going to be a he. We don't know what his views on education are going to be. But for as long as we have people like Pope Francis has out there advocating for education and speaking about how important our role is, we need to make sure that we are living up to that. And we need to make sure that we remember those things.
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio News, read by John Gibbs. For Friday, the 18th of April 2025. This week, two perennial struggles are taking place, both identified by the Times Educational Supplement. The first, as many teachers will recognise, is the struggle to keep arts significant in the curriculum. Reporter Sam Eyre describes how the significance of arts and the struggle to keep it in the curriculum is becoming more significant under pressure from English and maths. This, as many teachers will know, is that debate between the hard subjects and the soft subjects, which continues. Also in the Times Education magazine, Charlotte Cooper asks schools not to respond too quickly to moral panics, such as the ones that might be in response to the programme on television Adolescence, brilliant though it was. It pushes aside many other things that have to be accomplished in PSHE and demands again of schools that they should solve the problems of society. This time in The Guardian, a letter from Councillor Johnny Cranshaw, who describes the way in which multi-academy trusts are actually much more expensive and leech away millions in the salaries of executives and ancillary staff. His letter, right or wrong, continues the ongoing debate and re-evaluation in this country of the value and success of the multi-academy trust experiment. Also related to some of the perennial problems and questions that many people ask about schools was a thought-provoking article in The Guardian this week by Eva Wiseman. She asks, there certainly is a problem with attendance in schools at the moment. After the pandemic, it's really gone down significantly. Everyone agrees that this is the case. But should we be asking, what are schools for? Is this a symptom rather than a problem in itself? Is the problem something underlying, something that looks us in the face? Are these the schools, she asked, that Michael Gove built? Schools where the discourse is about delinquency, feckless parents, lazy students, and discipline. Should we be asking instead how we can make schools more receptive, more comfortable, more humane for students of all kinds? Again, right or wrong, these may be things that we should certainly be asking ourselves. Sky News picked up on the Andrew Tate phenomena. Misogyny. Young boys as young as 10 barking at female teachers, blocking doorways, and so forth. Is this part of the moral panic? Is it real? Or is something very significant happening in our society that's generating a toxic masculinity that we should all be aware of? In support of the suggestion that this is a very significant problem, more than 5,800 teachers were polled as part of a survey by the NASUWT union. And nearly 59% said they believed that the use of social media had contributed to a deterioration in pupil behaviour. Returning to the theme this week of perennial questions, ones that any teacher with a lengthy career will recognise, was the online site Teacherhead, which asked, does subject knowledge matter more than teaching techniques? Is it important that a teacher should be an expert in their field? Their knowledge impress the students, the depth and understanding of their particular field? Or is the art of teaching something that relates to relationships with students, techniques in the classroom, structure of lessons and planning? Can brilliant people be poor teachers? Can brilliant teachers not know much about their subject? Well, as for perennial questions, I'm sure that question will go on. And finally, a major story in the news this week, covered in The Independent and by the BBC, are free school breakfast clubs. They provide 30 minutes of morning childcare and a breakfast, and the trial is taking place in 750 schools until July. This was an election promise by the Labour Party and is being carried through by the government. Critics wonder whether it's being properly funded, with many schools suggesting that the costs will fall on them. It is generally agreed, however, that a good start and a breakfast and a period of time where students can begin their day before the pressures of school starts is probably a good thing. In the 1960s, we were urged to go to work on an egg. Not such a bad idea. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate your time to give us a roundup of the news over the last couple of weeks. So, the main crux of our show today is we are visiting that age-old issue that keeps coming up in educational circles of what we do about our boys. Now, it seems to me that the reason that this keeps coming up is because we're not actually doing anything. We keep suggesting that it's the boys who are the problem, that they need to modify their behavior, they need to modify how they respond to knowledge, they need to change themselves. We very rarely suggest that we need to change the system to suit them. And I can't help but think that that's very much where we're going wrong. Because, like I said, this has been an issue for as long as the education system has been in its current form. While I was doing my reading, I didn't want to go back too far, because, you know, a lot of the stuff that that was being suggested 50, 70, 100 years ago isn't applicable in today's system exactly. But it was still being identified as an issue. Even when boys were the ones who were being educated, it was being identified as an issue. And so I can't help but think that this same topic keeps coming up. It comes around time and time again. Boys have been back in the news lately with regards to Adolescence, that Netflix show, and how we should be educating them to be anti-misogynist, to be actively anti-misogynist. And again, it's all about how they need to change. And don't get me wrong, you know, in this instance, where we have the very negative influences espousing hateful views regarding women and how they should be treated, then absolutely that's something that needs to be tackled and needs to be changed. But I also think we need to look at the root cause of why boys are looking up to people like that, why they are looking up to the kind of grind set influences, and what they are missing in terms of more positive role models. Why do we not have anyone positive, anyone normal, anyone who is you know, just going to go out there and do his job and go home and be nice to his partner and be nice to his friends? You know, where are those role models for them? So that's kind of what we're going to get to the bottom of today. We're going to have a look at exactly how the media and how the education system considers boys, and kind of really unpick the messages that sends them. Now, I'm going to kind of lay out my own biases here. I was a working class boy. I was, you know, not a stereotypical working class boy. I liked football, but that was about it as far as my sporty interests went. I was very much a bookish child. I was a performer. I acted, I sang, I danced. So, you know, I'm not what you would see in the media as a traditional working class boy. But the fact is that is me. You know, I come from a working class background. I have done my entire life. I got into the local grammar school. I forgot the word then. I got into my local grammar school, but I chose not to go. I went to my local comprehensive school instead, where, quite frankly, to this day, I believe I did better. I performed better than I would have done had I been at the grammar school, because it kind of suited me being a big fish in a small pond. And so, you know, this is my lived experience of education, albeit that I've had maybe a slightly different outcome, in that I've gone on to university. I'm, you know, first generation university attendee. I've gone through, I have 2 bachelor's degrees, I have a postgrad certificate, I have a master's degree, studying for a doctorate. So I've kind of eschewed what we tend to assume is the traditional pathway for specifically working class boys, but for boys in particular. But again, that doesn't detract from the fact that this is my story. And in fact, now that I'm thinking about it, the fact that I'm having to preface my show with this, because I don't think that people would expect that to be my story, that I kind of feel like I'm a bit of an outlier, is quite telling, isn't it? About how we consider our boys, how we treat our boys, and again, specifically how we consider and treat our working class boys. So that's kind of what we're going to unpick today. I'm not expecting to come to any conclusions, quite frankly, because I think if I were able to come to a conclusion over the next hour on a Saturday morning, then people much more intelligent than me would have been able to have come to the same conclusions 70 years ago, and the system would be different and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But what I am going to do is kind of just platform some of the things that we need to be thinking about when we are thinking about how we best serve our boys. And I think that's where we need to start. We need to reframe this issue, because it's always framed as a problem, that the boys are being a problem, the behavior is a problem, the attitude is a problem. We need to switch that, because if that's the narrative that is being spoken, if that's the reality that's being created, that's what the boys are internalizing. They're internalizing that they are the problem. And if that's what they're internalizing, that's what they're going to live up to. Because if that's what they're being told they are, that's what they're going to be. And I think sometimes we forget that the children pay attention. You know, the children will be listening to the conversations that are being had about adolescence. We see it in teacher social media all the time. I was scrolling through TikTok day before yesterday, and there were a couple of videos, sort of all of the same ilk, that were basically teachers addressing their students and saying, if you can find my TikTok, why can't you find the essay that you owe me? You know, and it's done in jest, but it's true. You know, children are finding teacher platforms. Children are aware that we're having these conversations. And so if our boys, if our young men are finding these conversations and they're always hearing themselves being positioned as the issue, what is the problem with boys? Then they're going to feel awful about themselves, and they're going to internalize this idea that they are the issue, and it becomes this kind of self-repeating cycle, doesn't it? They are being told that they're the issue anyway, so why should they bother adapting? So we're going to frame this positively. We're going to talk about how we can support our boys. We're going to talk about how we can make sure that we get the very best out of them that we can. Because I think just reframing the issue into that, how do we support them rather than how do we change them, is the conversation that we ought to be having. And unfortunately, it's a conversation that we don't have enough. We'll start with some home truths. So it is true that working class boys, and then if we're going to categorize even more, white working class boys. So again, this is the category that I fall into. They are the lowest performing educational group throughout education. The research from King's College London shows us that the attainment gap starts straight away. The attainment gap starts at the age of 5 and it widens as the boys go up through school. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. There are all sorts of reasons for this. We have got the fact that, you know, education starts outside of the home, and we've got this whole cultural capital idea that starts very, very early on. Which children are being read to by their parents versus which children aren't. And again, that's not a critique of the parents, because a lot of parents, you know, they are out straight away working. As soon as the paternity leave ends, the dad goes back to work. As soon as the maternity leave ends, or even before, the mum goes straight back to work. Because quite often, particularly with working class families, you can't afford not to. And I know lots of people who have felt terribly guilty about that, about having to go back to work sooner than they would have liked. But they do have to financially. They can't survive if they don't. But that also means that they don't necessarily have the time to read to their children as much as they like. They don't have the time to go to museums with them as much as they might like. They don't have the time to take them down to the park and play as much as they would like. And so quite often I think this is where that attainment gap really starts. And I think the dissolution of early start centres, the dissolution of kind of playgroups and you know, those very early education centres where the children will be not just babysat while the parents are at work, but also educated whilst the parents are at work, where they are given that access to cultural capital, they are given that access to books, they are given the access to imaginative play and all of that sort of thing. If those became not only more prevalent but more affordable, then that might help to close that gap, even just a little bit. But what is very telling is, again, this research from King's College London, it suggests that attainment alone doesn't explain the lack of higher education progression amongst working class young men. Why are our working class boys, when they get to 18, not going on to university? What's happening there? It's not about that attainment gap, because that kind of doesn't really matter. Because, by the time you get to your A levels, by the time you get to 16, 17, 18 years old, you can catch up. You can learn the knowledge that you need to learn to get the grades that you need to get into university. But they're just not going. So there's something there. There's something cultural there that is stopping our working class young men from going into university. And quite frankly, I think it's because of the lower expectations that we have of our boys in general, of our working class boys specifically, but of our boys in general. I found a white paper while I was doing my research for this, and its suggestion to the kind of, in inverted commas, problem of boys in school was to lower the school leaving age to 14 and increase the number of apprenticeships. So the solution to the issue of boys, of school not serving boys correctly, was just to take them out and get them into work. As if our boys can't succeed academically. And again, this kind of ties into what I was saying a few minutes ago about how if they keep being told that they can't succeed, if they keep being told that they are the issue, then that's what they're going to grow into. It's a bit like, if you keep like snakes and goldfish, I think, are the same as well, aren't they? They grow to the size of their tank. And I do think that people are the same. I think children will grow to the size of your expectations of them. And if the expectation of this white paper, of something that was submitted to the government for consideration, is that we should lower the leaving age so that our boys can leave and get jobs, we are telling them that they are not worthy of education. We are telling them that they shouldn't be there. And so again, it is no wonder that they don't want to be. Quite often when we look at apprenticeships, now don't get me wrong, I love the apprenticeship route. I do think it's very important, and I do think that it suits lots of people of all genders, of all ages, of all academic abilities. I think that it's important. But quite often they are framed as equity. They are framed as, if you're not doing too well in school, if you're not an academic, then you can go and get an apprenticeship and you will have the same opportunities just through a different route. But quite often they feel like a containment strategy. Quite often they feel like a way to get the children that schools are struggling with out of school and into somebody else's hands, and just kind of then tread some water, learn a trade that they may or may not go into when they leave the apprenticeship until they are 18 and they can then officially leave education. And hopefully they do then go into that apprenticeship. But what happens if at 14 they choose an apprenticeship, they choose a career that they don't want to do for the next 60 years? What if they change their minds? But they are then only qualified in this one thing because they have only a year 9 breadth of knowledge. what do they do then? At the moment, going through a career change is actually quite easy. Getting extra qualifications is actually quite straightforward. As an adult, you can retake GCSEs, you can take brand new GCSEs, you can take A levels, you can get degrees. There are no learning barriers to adult education. But I think if you have not been through that process already, if you dropped out of school at 14, it can be much harder to access that because you haven't had that experience of what the educational norm is. You haven't had that experience of having exams. You have to learn those study skills. There are a lot of kind of things that we take for granted in terms of actually sitting an exam and getting a qualification that you learn when you are 15 that can be much harder to pick up as an adult. And so I think quite often, particularly if we take a very young route into apprenticeships, we are actually just narrowing down what our young people can go into, what they can do with their lives. Now, the other suggestion in this same white paper was that alongside apprenticeships, we make sure that business classes are on offer, because young men like the idea of going into business. And we know that that's true. We know that the uptake for GCSE and A-level business studies is very, very high kind of across the country. Children are interested in business, but not everybody can own a business. If everybody owns their own business, then there are no workers for that business. If everybody is a leader, then nobody is a follower. And so I do sometimes wonder whether, this idea that, do your apprenticeship in plumbing, do a business course alongside it, and then open up your own plumbing business, become a contractor, work for yourself. It's one of those things that's great in theory. And of course, under a capitalist system, it's great because competition breeds innovation. Because the more plumbers we have, the better other plumbers will become because they've got to be better in order to get the jobs. But what about those plumbers who are not getting the jobs because there are so many of them, where they don't have the security of a regular job, a 9 to 5, or I apologize, plumbers, I actually don't know what your working hours are if you work for somebody else. If they don't have that security of just having a job because they are self-employed, because they work for themselves, then what are they going to do? Particularly if there then isn't another option because they were rushed straight into an apprenticeship at 14. So we need to think very carefully about how we structure these solutions to the issue. We need to make sure that our solutions are not just farming the boys out to somebody else, making them somebody else's problem, and minimizing what they can do in their futures, stopping them from having opportunities, just so that we can then stop saying that there is an issue. In 2001, Diane Ray, I apologize to Diane if I'm mispronouncing her surname, she published a paper called Finding or Losing Yourself, Working Class Relationships to Education, which makes very, very interesting reading. She says that education for working class children has historically been designed not to empower them, but to control and pacify them. And that despite the fact that we've had about 100 years of our current universal education system, these structural inequalities remain entrenched. She argues that the education system valorizes middle-class structures, middle-class values, and attempts to marginalize or erase working-class values. Now, I understand that this is kind of a very British problem because, as international listeners, I'm sure you will be aware, probably more so than many of our British listeners, because we don't think about it that much. Our class system has been entrenched in our society for thousands of years. And it's still here. We may ignore it, we may not be aware of it, but it does still exist. You know, there is still this idea that you are frowned upon if you rise above your station. You know, you can be a class traitor, and you don't want to be a class traitor. You don't want to be different from the people that you grew up around. But where our education system suggests that one class is better than another, where it does try to, you know, to its credit, where it does try to push social mobility, but it's doing that in a societal structure that resists social mobility. It is, again, suggesting to our working class children, again, of all genders, that they shouldn't be there, that it's not for them. In Diane's study, she said that a key tension was the balance between self-improvement and remaining true to your roots. There is still a systemically classist structure within the UK. And it does work both ways, like I've just said. You don't want to be seen as a class traitor. You don't want to be seen going against your roots. And in fact, we have whole sitcoms about it. The BBC sitcom Keeping Up Appearances, very, very funny, but is about this lady, Hyacinth Bucket, who comes from a working class, a very low class family, but she has aspirations above her station. She tries to be, in inverted commas, better than she is, higher class than she was raised, and she is always set up as the buffoon. She is the comic character. She is the one that we're expected to laugh at, and a lot of the comedy in that show comes from that juxtaposition of her trying to be not even a working class person, but an upper class person, against her working class roots, against her working class sisters. And if you look at reviews and if you look at analyses of the show, you will find that a lot of the audience, they tend to resonate more with the working class characters because they are seen as being, in inverted commas, true to their roots, as opposed to Hyacinth, who is trying to be above her station, who is seen as trying to be somebody that she's not. So in the UK, we are not very good at upward mobility. And this is, of course, one of the reasons that we have this tension in education, because education is all about upward mobility. Education is all about making something of yourself, making yourself better, knowing more things so that you can do a job that you enjoy, first and foremost, and a job that benefits people. And you might not necessarily want to be seen as being conceited enough, outside of your station enough, outside of your roots enough to think that you can be of benefit to others. I remember when I started this show, I told a few of my colleagues that that Tom, our CEO, had offered me this platform. And one of them said to me, "Oh, so you must really feel like you're a good teacher if you can go on the radio and tell other people how to be teachers." And I was kind of taken aback by that, because I was like, well, no, I've just been offered this platform and I think it's a cool thing to do. But there is this idea that if you try and offer your knowledge to somebody else, then you must be a little bit conceited because you must feel like you know what you're talking about. And that kind of, again, is ingrained in our society, is ingrained at that anti-upward mobility stance that we have. That's a really interesting paper, Working Class Relationships to Education. And it's if you're interested in the class structure in the UK and its impact on education, it is well worth a read. The next thing that I read was a study by the British Psychological Association, which looked at why so many, specifically white working class boys, underachieve. And it started by talking about how media and literature both portray white working class boys as, in inverted commas, educational failures who have restricted life chances. And again, this ties into what I was saying at the top. If that's what boys keep seeing, if that's how they see themselves represented, if that's how they are told they should be, then that's going to be what they try to be. And I don't understand why we don't see that. We see it when it comes to the manosphere influencers. We understand that people like Andrew Tate have this power and influence over our boys. We understand that the institutionalized misogyny is something that our boys can see and can think is normal. And yet we don't apply that same critical lens to other aspects of media, to less obvious aspects of media, I suppose. We don't apply that same lens to the shows that portray the white working class men as educational failures, as not reaching their potential. But what the British Psych Association realized was that up until they did their research, there had been no mixed methods research to actually explore those views, to see if there was any truth to it, or to see whether it was just a stereotype being perpetuated because that was what we kept seeing in the media. This study was really interesting. It undertook a two-phase sequential mixed methods exploratory design. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? With purposeful sampling. So basically what they did was they took a bunch of key stage 3 children, so years 7, 8, and 9, between the ages of 11 and 13, 14, all of whom were recorded on their school data as being white British, all of whom were in receipt of free school meals. Now, whether or not that is a class indicator is debatable, but it's how this study has chosen to justify class indication, and who went to a comprehensive secondary school. So again, for our international listeners, if a child's parents do not meet a certain income threshold, then they are eligible for free school meals. So that essentially means that they are fed at lunchtime at no cost to them or their parents. And traditionally, this is something that was open to everybody in the British education system. And it was designed specifically for working and lower class families to ensure that the children had a hot meal at some point during the day, just in case the parents couldn't afford to feed them a hot meal at home. So we have, at least in some ways, our system has always looked out for the working and lower class children. We just haven't always done it in a way that has been educationally beneficial. But at least we've been looking out for their health, for their well-being. So that's something. The participants in this study were categorized as either low or high/average attaining based on their current attainment level. So two groups, one group who were low attainers, one group who were high or average attainers. So it was a fairly representative sample that they chose. I was quite impressed with their sampling there. In phase 1, they used something called a School Attitude Assessment Survey revised, which was basically a questionnaire that was used to measure the boys' attitudes on 5 factors of schooling that are associated with achievement. They noticed that there was no significant difference between the high and the low achievers in terms of their academic self-perception. There was no significant difference in their attitude towards school. There was no difference in their attitude towards teachers. There was no difference in their goal valuation. There was no difference in their self-regulation and motivation. So essentially what they found was between the attainment groups, there was absolutely no difference whatsoever. So being a lower attainer doesn't necessarily mean that you will have lower aspirations. It doesn't mean that you will necessarily hate school. It doesn't necessarily mean that you think you're going to fail your GCSEs. Similarly, being a higher attainer doesn't necessarily mean that you like school. It doesn't necessarily mean that you think you're going to pass. It doesn't necessarily mean that you think you're going to go on to university, which I think is a very important point. Because as we saw in Diane's study, and as we saw from the data from King's College London, it's not attainment, it's not that attainment gap that stops our working class boys from going to university. So it's actually got nothing to do with their attainment, it's got nothing to do with their ability, it's got nothing to do with their grades at all. There is something about how education in general is perceived that is what is influencing their own perceptions, their own views of the education system.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
So the second stage of this study, this is the British Psych Association study, involved the lower attaining pupils only. And it was in a semi-structured interview form. So the interviewers sat down one-on-one with the boys that they were interviewing. They had a list of questions that they would use, but those questions kind of acted as prompts for a broader conversation. And the purpose was to explore the boys' beliefs and views about schooling. They then used a thematic analysis to identify themes. So they went through the interviews and they pulled out what they had in common to kind of give an overarching view of how this particular set of boys felt about school. And they found that there were 4 overarching themes. So kind of in this wider discussion, there were 4 things that all of the boys had in common when they spoke about it. And those themes were feeling valued in the learning relationship, academic self-perception, the ability to choose your own path, and academic misalignment. So they found, as if I'm important enough to have been involved in this study, they found, and we know from their findings, that what is valued by these children, and I think, looking at those themes, I really think this can be extended out probably to all children, not just boys, not just working class boys, but all of our children. This ability to feel valued at school, to feel valued as a learner, not just as a person, but as a learner, somebody who can take on the information. Your own belief in your academic ability, your ability to choose, and what happens when you feel like you've made the wrong choice. All of those are the things that we should be focusing on. And once again, it kind of comes back to modelling, doesn't it? Everything that I'm talking about today comes back to how working class boys are seeing themselves modelled, and how they are seeing opportunities that may or may not be open to them. There's a reality TV show that I've become quite addicted to lately. That's so bad to say, isn't it? I should be anti-reality TV, I feel. I like to have it on in the background. But there's this one particular show that I've been quite enjoying. And the contestants, it's a reality game show. Contestants are from a range of walks of life. Most of them are, would-be influencers, but that's kind of the nature of reality TV game shows these days. But you've got people who are coming in from trades. You've got teachers. It's a wide range of people. But I've noticed there's only one person who works in the arts. He's a stand-up comedian, and he is a right honourable. So he is upper class, he is landed gentry, his family has money. And he is like I said, he's the only example of somebody who has gone into the arts I think I'm on like my sixth series of this particular show, but he's the only contestant that I've seen who is in the arts. And I'm thinking, actually, that's quite representative of what we see on TV. In these game shows that, let's be real, our children do enjoy. I know that my sixth form girls, and particularly at my previous school, but in general, they watch Love Island. Kids will still watch I'm a Celebrity. They will watch Big Brother. They will watch all of those shows. And what they are seeing there is what they are internalizing as being normal. Now, this example opens up a whole other conversation about the fact that it does tend to be the people who come from wealth that go into the arts, because they can afford to, because the arts don't pay very well. And so, you can only really pursue them if you don't need the money. But that then means that the arts don't have to pay well, because the people who go into them don't need the money. And that then becomes this vicious cycle that is its own barrier to entry into an artistic profession. But if you are a working class young man from a council estate like I was, and you're watching TV and the only people you see going into stand-up comedy are people who have got land and generational wealth, you're going to think, oh, okay, so those are the kinds of people who are stand-up comedians, and so that's not a job that's open for me. Even worse is when you get people who go into the arts claiming that they are from a working class background, but it turns out that they're not. Because then not only is your identity being co-opted as a dress-up, but it reinforces the idea that it's only people from classes above you who can go into the arts. So it's all about, not all about, it's a lot about who we are platforming and why we are platforming them. And, I don't expect reality TV show casting producers to think about these things when they are casting, because their job is to produce an entertaining TV show. That's their interest. That's why they've gone into the media. That's why they've gone into that role. because they want to create a really good show. And that means that they're going to cast the people that they think are going to create entertaining TV. But I think quite often, because we don't really talk about that connection between what we watch and what we perceive, between that creation of reality based on our media, then it's not something that we can expect people to think about, even if maybe they should. Maybe if we had these kinds of conversations more, where we thought more about the people who are being given platforms, then different agencies, including things that are seemingly disparate, like TV producers and schools, could work together in thinking about who is platformed and why. Now, in this day and age, that might seem a bit pointless because anybody can have a platform. You don't even need to be offered one. I'm here because I was offered this platform by Tom, and I will forever be grateful for that. But, it would be very easy to jump on Podbean and set up my own account, set up my own podcast. I could set up a YouTube channel. We know that people are getting famous on Instagram, on TikTok, on all of the social media. You don't need to be platformed anymore because you can create a platform. But I wonder if that means that the people who have the ability to platform others do need to take a little bit more care and a little bit more responsibility in choosing who they platform, because now they're not just giving somebody a voice, but they're boosting it. And they are really kind of showing, particularly our young people, who they can be, who they could be, who they should be aspiring to be. The last study that I looked at for this one, for this show, is called Boys Will Be Boys, Won't They? Change and Continuities in Contemporary Young Working Class Masculinities. This is by Steve Roberts, and this was published in 2013. And again, I think this is really pertinent because, again, the conversation at the moment, at least from my perspective, tends to be a lot about demonizing masculinity. We talk about toxic masculinity a lot when we talk about these influencers that we don't want our boys following. And we talk about who they shouldn't be following. But we very rarely talk about positive masculinity. We very rarely point them in the direction of people that they ought to be following. We just tell them who they shouldn't be. And as we know, young people will always do the opposite of what we say. So if they think that we don't want them watching somebody, then they're going to want to watch them. Whereas if we were to just position, platform more positive role models, then we wouldn't need to tell them who to watch and who not to watch. They would have that choice. And as we know from the British Psych Association study, the children like having a choice. They want some kind of ownership. Children very often feel like they don't have a lot of control over their lives, and so they want control where they can take it. And who they follow on social media is one place that they can have some control. So we should be thinking about really platforming those positive role models. So Stephen's research wanted to challenge the boys will be boys stereotype. It wanted to challenge this idea that working class young men are inherently resistant to change, particularly in terms of gender roles, in terms of work, and in terms of domestic responsibility. So again, it was kind of doing the same as the British Psych Association study was doing, in looking at the stereotypes of working class boys and saying, is this true? And just like with the British Psych Association research, the answer was no, these stereotypes are not true. It builds on Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity, which traditionally links working class masculinity with toughness, homophobia, and resistance to feminized work. So again, it's this idea that being a man, being masculine, is doing all of these things that the toxic influences are saying that you need to do. That can be contrasted, though, with Anderson's concept of inclusive masculinity, which suggests that masculinity is in fact less hierarchical and more flexible than the hegemonic masculinities. So the hegemonic, the homophobic, misogynistic masculinity is not the only one. And again, this is maybe where we need to start thinking about the language that we're using. So when we talk about toxic masculinity, we do that because it gets the point across very quickly. These are not the behaviors that we should be engaging in. These are not the behaviors that we want our boys engaging in. But that qualifier, toxic, next to masculinity, it can suggest that all masculinity is toxic. What maybe we ought to be doing is framing our conversation as hegemonic masculinity versus inclusive masculinity, and then seeing that the hegemonic masculinity is what is toxic, whereas the inclusive masculinity is not. I'm a linguist, so I'm going to be biased on this point, but language is powerful. Language shapes the way that we perceive things. Language creates our perceptions. We know this. All of the science points towards this. And yet we tend not to be very careful with our language. And this is where a lot of these issues begin to arise. Just because we are using our language in an ad hoc way, instead of really thinking about what we mean. So Roberts' study is based on qualitative interviews. So again, it's an interview study. This is kind of one of my favorite research techniques. And he interviewed 24 young men aged between 18 and 24 in Kent, in the southeast of England, who were all employed in the retail sector. So working class young men, all in full-time employment, around the age that you might have expected them to go to university. And they were asked to reflect on their work, their current role, and their future domestic roles. And what Roberts noticed was that there has been this shift in attitudes towards emotional labor. So a lot of the theories around hegemonic masculinity will say that service work is feminized and it's emasculating. But that's not how these young men felt. We accept that these young men chose to go into retail roles, but we also have to accept that there may not have been many options open to them. You know, we know what the job market looks like. It wasn't, let's be frank, it wasn't all that much better in 2013 than it is now. And so it may be that retail was not the dream job that these boys aspired to, these young men aspired to, but it's the job that they found themselves in. What this study found was that they actually enjoyed the customer interaction. They valued the social aspect of retail. They found pride and a sense of identity in helping other people. So all of these things that are traditionally viewed as feminine and could be viewed as not being things that working class young men value, actually are valued as part of these young men's perceptions of their own masculinity. They quite often spoke positively about the banter that they could have with regulars and how good they felt when they could help customers. And I want to pick up on banter there for a second, because banter is something else that is demonized in school. And I think it's quite often unfairly demonized in school because we don't really help our children with the nuances. I will forever remember one of my tutor groups. I look back with them fondly. They were possibly one of my favorite tutor groups ever, to be fair. And I took them over in year 9, but I'd known them kind of from when they were in the prep school. I knew them all quite well. And as part of our tutor time as part of our CPSHE curriculum, I had to do a lesson with them on banter. And I told them this and they all groaned. And they all said, and they kind of, it was like simultaneous. It was quite creepy. They all chirped out the line, banter is not nice. Banter is bullying, blah, blah, blah. And they spent a good 5-10 minutes telling me about how they were tired of being told about banter because they were told about it all the time and they just didn't want to hear about it anymore. But what they had never been told is that banter can be okay. You just need to think about the circumstances around it. You just need to think about whether the person you're bantering with is actually receptive to it. Now, I'm not going to lie. When I was their age, when I was 13, I would not have been receptive to banter at all. I was a sensitive young man, and so I would not have liked that. And looking back on my own schooling, I think a lot of what I perceived as bullying could have been, from the bully's point of view, banter, but that was not how I saw it. That was not how I framed it. Because I couldn't take it. And of course, at 14, I didn't have the means to articulate that, so I just thought I was being bullied. And I kind of had that conversation with my tutor group, and I was like, the difference between banter and bullying, it's not the words that you're using. It's not even your intent. It's how the person you're talking to is going to receive it. It's whether the person that you're talking to is banterable or not. And, if somebody is or isn't, that's not a judgment call. Somebody isn't a better person just because they can take banter versus somebody who can't. It's just how it is. And they were a lot more receptive to that than just being told you shouldn't banter with people, because they wanted to. They wanted to have that fun. They understood that when they were with their friends and they were making jokes at each other's expense, and they all found it funny, including the person who was the recipient of the joke, they felt that was a good time. What they really needed to know was that not everybody likes to be on the receiving end of it. Not everybody thinks it's funny. So just be careful of the people that you are bantering with. Make sure that it is the correct person. And I think framing it that way, we were able to make sure that we weren't demonizing something that they enjoyed, that we weren't demonizing something that they bonded over. They bonded over being able to banter with each other. It created that sense of community. It created that sense of cohesion in their friendship group. It was important to them, but we were also protecting the rights of the people who didn't want to be involved. And I think they responded well to that. I didn't have, kind of through their time with me as their tutor, I had no issues where kind of I had to distinguish between bullying and banter from their behaviour.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
The next thing that this study, the Roberts study, uncovered was the fact that these young men didn't really see physical and emotional labour as a binary. They didn't really see a divide. They did quite often say that they preferred floor work to tills. So they preferred being out on the shop floor, stacking shelves, moving product around, to being on the till serving the customers. This wasn't necessarily because they were moving more, it was because they felt they had more autonomy. And I thought that was quite interesting, because quite often one of the big issues that comes up when we talk about boys in education is the fact that boys like to move around, the perception that boys like to move around, which I think is in general true. Boys are quite fidgety. They do like to move. We know they like to roughhouse. There is all of that. And I'm not saying that all of that should be permissible in school, because, we don't allow it in society, and part of school is training them how to function in society. A big part of that is keeping your hands to yourself. That's something to learn. But we also shouldn't assume that one of the reasons that boys are not doing so well in school is because it's not very physical. Because again, that's just something that we have decided is true, but that the research is telling us isn't. What in fact they didn't like about the till work wasn't the standing still, it's the monotonous scripted nature of it and the fact that it was performative. And we know from the conclusion we came to earlier on in this study that they relish the opportunity to build relationships with people. They relish the regulars that they could banter with. They like having that actual emotional connection with people. They don't like the falsity of it. I quite often on the show critique the build relationships with your pupils mentality, because that does seem to be trotted out as a solution to everything. Child hasn't handed in their homework, have you considered building a relationship? Child throws a chair out of the window, have you considered building a relationship? But actually, I think in this case, where we're looking at our working class boys, that is really important, because the research is telling us that that's what young men want. They want the connection. They want the connection that quite often the media is telling them they shouldn't want, because that's not, in inverted commas, manly enough, because we're focused on the hegemonic masculinities instead of the inclusive masculinities. But it also means that we are providing them with good role models. We are modeling to them what it is to build a positive relationship as people who have all been to university. We all have degrees in something. You have to in order to be a teacher. And who are, making a living within academia, who are succeeding within academia. And again, I think, especially for teachers who share their backgrounds, for teachers like me, who, like I said at the top of the show, I was that working class boy, albeit, a bit more bookish than the stereotype would have you believe. We can be those role models that quite often they are missing. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes that can be the thing that falls to the bottom of the to-do list. can't it? When you are feeling burnt out from your workload, from everything that you have to do, then remembering on top of that that you are a good role model for your gender and your class and your educational status, that's yet another form of emotional labor that could be really difficult to handle. But it is actually very important. And I think it's important that as teachers, we talk about these things. We talk about our own backgrounds, because regardless of which social class we come from, regardless of which university we went to, regardless of whether we are the first person in our family that went to university like I did, or I was, or whether we are one in a long line of, all of my family have graduated from Cambridge. That's our story, and that will be the story of people in our classrooms. And we can't be those role models to them unless they know those stories, unless they know those things about us. What I found really interesting was that quite often in Richard's study, rather than distancing themselves from emotional labor, many of the participants actually redefined masculinity to include that caring, competent customer service. They challenged the idea that physical labor is inherently more manly than emotional labor. One of them said, I don't spend 8 hours at work and then checking my shorts to see if I've still got a body part, the word for which he used, I can't use on breakfast radio. So they realized that actually the job that they do does not dictate their gender presentation. It does not dictate their masculinity. It does not dictate their physicality. It's the job that they do. It's part of who they are. So ultimately, like I said, I've not come to any conclusions today because I can't do that in an hour and a half. But ultimately, what I think we need to do is think a lot about the Bourdieusian concept of habitus. Now, whether we know it or not, we talk about Bourdieu a lot in education because we're always talking about cultural capital. That's a big thing at the moment. And it is very important. And it is important for this discussion because quite often, the ability to get into university can boil down to cultural capital. Do you know how to write a personal statement? Because if you've not had somebody go to university before you to help you, and you don't have a form tutor who has got the time or the inclination or the or even the autonomy to help you with your personal statement, you may not be able to write one. So cultural capital is important, but actually more importantly, we need to think about habitus, that internal sense of who you are. If we go back to Ray's study, working class students in university, they often feel a sense of class hybridity because they, in inverted commas, understand that working class people don't tend to go to university. They find themselves surrounded by middle class, by upper class people. And they don't fit in with those people because of the class structure. But they also no longer fit in with their working class peers either. And so we then become this kind of hybrid class who doesn't really feel like they fit in anywhere. Habitus is about who you are on the inside, who you feel you are, based on who you are around, who you surround yourself with. So once again, it comes down to that concept of role models, doesn't it? So I think if I were going to say that I had a conclusion, I would say that a lot of the solutions to the issue that boys have in school that are currently being proffered come down to lowering expectations and telling our boys that they're not worthy of being in school. Whereas what we need to do is the opposite. We need to build them up. We need to show them that they are worthy. We need to overcome our own internal prejudices and our own influence of the media to understand that the way we're told boys perceive school is not actually the way that they do perceive school. The way that we're told boys perceive masculinity is not the way that all boys perceive masculinity. And we need to make sure that we are providing and platforming those positive academic role models for them, so that we don't have to lower expectations, so that we don't have to say, you are not as worthy of being in school as the girls are, but so that we can say, look, here are some men who have succeeded and you can succeed too. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that that those of you who tuned in have found something over the last hour and a half to think about. If you do think about anything that we've talked about today, if you do have any ideas, if you do have any opinions, if you do have any thoughts, then please do get in touch with me via social media. I'm at Mr. D. Lester. That's MRDLESTER on both X and Blue Sky, because I really would be interested to hear your own experiences, your own thoughts on boys in education and what we can do to make sure that our boys succeed in the educational system without dumbing it down for them and without limiting their opportunities for growth. Do stay with us on Teachers Talk Radio, because we have a lot of good shows coming up over the weekend. Famida is on at 1 o'clock with the lunchtime show, so I do hope that you will stick around and listen to her. If you are an MFL teacher, please remember that we have Journal Club on Wednesday at 7 p.m. So make sure that you've read that article, but even if you haven't, come along anyway, because I've read it, so I'll talk about it with you. Although obviously I understand if you are currently knee-deep in speaking exams and you just want an hour off, I completely understand that, but I do hope to see as many of you there as possible. If you are not an MFL teacher, if you don't come to Journal Club, but you do enjoy listening to me on a Saturday morning, I will see you next Saturday at 9 a.m. for the next edition of Saturday Morning Breakfast. Thank you very much, everybody. Have yourselves a great weekend, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.